Hello, everyone, and welcome to AP US History for Winners with your teacher, Mr. Johnson. Last time we talked about European colonization and the different countries that colonized North America. And today we are talking about the regions of the British colonies. We're really going to zoom in on the British colonies today and break down the different regions. So if you are ready, let's begin. First, let's start with a map so you can kind of get a feel for the colonies of Britain. So we're going to kind of talk about these in four categories. New England, which you see on the top right in the pinkish color. The middle colonies, you see kind of, in the middle in the yellow. The Chesapeake colonies, and Chesapeake is referring to Virginia and Maryland. And then the southern colonies of the Carolinas and Georgia in blue. So we're going to kind of break down each region and the important things about each one. First, let's talk about New England. So it's made up of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New Hampshire. And you can see there's no Maine at the time. Massachusetts looked a little bit funky. Now, most of the New England colonies were settled by Puritans, so they are settled for religious reasons. So that's kind of that God part of the three G's. And these Puritans are coming over from Britain. They're trying to purify the English church and remove any elements that they deemed impure. And so that's one of the reasons that they come over to the New World, is to kind of have their own way to follow their religion without any restrictions from the English church. And we see the Massachusetts Bay Colony, founded by John Winthrop, as probably one of the more famous colonies in New England. There's this very famous speech we'll read called "City Upon a Hill." Maybe it's a speech, like an excerpt, okay, from this speech. And it talks about how they want to form a perfect society for others to look up to. And it's very influential in how this colony is trying to be founded. And it has a lot of the religious elements of it. Now, Massachusetts Bay Colony, while they're coming here for religious freedom, they themselves are not religiously tolerant of people who have different ideas than their own. And two really famous examples, then we should definitely know these names. So these ones, Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson, are banished for challenging the church in Massachusetts. And they basically go to Rhode Island. Roger Williams actually founds Rhode Island, and he believes in this idea of religious toleration. He actually even pays Native Americans for some of the land. And Anne Hutchinson will soon follow and establish kind of found another city in Rhode Island because of this lack of religious toleration in Massachusetts. Continuing to talk about the New England colonies, some of their economics and demographics of them. They have a lot of small towns in the New England colonies, and their economy is very mixed. So they have agriculture and commerce, trading, a lot of small family farms, like subsistence farming. Sometimes you'll see it called that. That means they're farming what they can to get by. A lot of merchants, shipbuilding, whaling. I mean, you've heard of Connecticut's hockey team, right? They were called the Hartford Whalers. That's because Connecticut had a big history of whaling. So you can see, while there's money to be made in the New England colonies, it's not like these colonies were founded as the sole purpose to make money. A lot of these colonies are founded by people who want that religious freedom. And then one thing to note is that slavery does exist in the New England colonies. It's important to know that slavery exists in all of these colonies, African slavery, okay? It's on a smaller scale in the New England colonies because these colonies are not founded so much for the creation of wealth, but there is still slavery there. Now, we need to talk now about one specific event or series of events in the New England colonies called the Halfway Covenant and the Salem Witch Trials. Okay, and these are important to understand the religious ideas of New England and kind of what happens because of them. So we want to understand these two terms. First, the Halfway Covenant. This was a late 17th century religious policy in New England that allowed for partial church membership for children of church members, even if these parents weren't fully converted. Okay, so the idea here is they wanted to increase the number of church members that they had. But a lot of people are criticizing this because it's diluting the purity of the church, because now they're having people that are not fully converted into their church. And what this is a good example of is that it's reflecting the different religious attitudes and the changing religious attitudes that are happening in a colonial society where these people are now in charge of making up their own rules and decisions about things like religion. And another main takeaway here is that eventually it's going to lessen the division between the elect members of the church, or the higher members of the church, and the regular members, because we're increasing this church membership. All right, and so now a similar religious theme, that's kind of why I put these together, is the Salem witch trials. Now, these occurred in 1692 in Salem, Massachusetts, and they were a series of accusations, trials, and even executions for people that they thought were witches. And while they weren't witches, the trials that they had were not fair. They relied on spectral or religious evidence. They're driven by fear. They're driven by these social tensions. Most of the people who are tried are women of the lower class. So we can see some of these other issues coming about in the Salem witch trials, and it ends up in about 20 executions. And a lot of these executions, basically, they're not following what we would think of as fair legal proceedings. Okay. So this is really good context for America's current court system and the court system that they come up with in the Constitution and when they're founding America, because now we have ideas like representation from, you have a lawyer to represent you. We have thoughts like you're innocent until you're proven guilty. And these are things that were not present in the Salem witch trial, which resulted in those executions. So it's a good way to provide some context if you ever get like a legal question about representation or how our court system works. All right, moving on from New England to the middle colonies. Now we're going to talk about New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware mainly. The important to understand the economy of each one of these regions, and so make sure we get this. But the economy of the middle colonies is diverse. They're going to have cereal crops. And what is a cereal crop? Basically, those are like grains, wheat, things you can grow to eat. Okay. And they're going to export those to try to make some money off of them. And there's going to be a lot of shipbuilding because there's a lot of forests in these areas. So they're going to use the timber from that to make ships. And so you can kind of see, just like we talked about with the Native Americans, the colonies are going to react to the environment around them, and that's how they're going to, base their economies off of. So that's why the middle colonies have a diverse economy. So put that in your heads, okay? Now, one important individual to be aware of is William Penn, and he is the guy who founds Pennsylvania. William Penn, Pennsylvania, right? And he has this idea of a holy experiment where he wants to found Pennsylvania on the ideas of religious toleration and accepting of other people. He's a Quaker. Okay, so we see a lot of religion being a motivation for a lot of these colonies. But compared to Massachusetts, these colonies are tolerant of other religion. And Pennsylvania is tolerant of other religions. And similar to Rhode Island, they pay Native Americans for land in Pennsylvania as well. So some kind of different beliefs in Pennsylvania. Demographically speaking, like who lives there in these middle colonies, well, it's very diverse. They have more immigrants in these places from different parts of the world. They also do have a mix of indentured servants and slaves. So we got to make sure we know what these terms are. An indentured servant is somebody who is basically agreed to work for a set period of time in exchange for free passage to this new world. So basically, let's say you live in England, you want to get to the new world, but you can't afford it. You say, hey, I will work for 5 to 7 years for you if you pay for my ship ride over to the new world. That's an indentured servant. Really important we understand what that term means. There's also slaves in the middle colonies as well. Like we said, there's slaves in all of these colonies. But make sure we understand the indentured servant term. Okay, this might be a new one for you. Moving on to another group of colonies, the Chesapeake colonies. This is, when you hear the word Chesapeake, think Maryland and Virginia. Now, the economy in these areas is agricultural. They are going to focus on cash crops. That is crops that you can grow for money, not to eat. And the most famous example at this time is tobacco. So put that in your heads. Tobacco is the way that these Virginia and Maryland are making money. They're going to grow the tobacco, sell it, export it. Okay. Another really important term, bold this one, underline this one, the Maryland Acts of Toleration. And what these are is basically in Maryland, they had laws that granted religious toleration to all Christians, not all religions, but to all Christians. And the idea here was that this was supposed to protect Catholics because a lot of the other colonies were anti-Catholic. They were Christian, but they were not Catholic. And so Maryland has these, and this is a good piece of context for you to use thinking about religious freedom and the freedom of religion like we have in the Bill of Rights, okay? Now, in the Chesapeake colonies, they get a lot of their labor from indentured servants and slaves as well. And so it's important to understand that they're using indentured servants for their labor, especially in the beginning. And they have this system called the headright system in these colonies, where they would provide 50 acres of land for each indentured servant that they got to the colonies. So basically, the thought is that if you could convince indentured servants to come to the colonies, you would get more land. And so this is a way to try to expand the number of people living in the colonies. Now, we do need to talk about a really, really, really important event that goes down in Virginia called Bacon's Rebellion. And this is going to pop up all over the AP exam. So make sure we really understand this whole term, this whole event. Okay, so this is in 1676. And what this is a rebellion led by this guy, Nathaniel Bacon. And it's against the governor of Virginia, William Berkeley. Okay. And basically, why does this happen? All right. So Nathaniel Bacon is a farmer and he's an indentured servant, and he feels that the government is not doing enough to protect them from Native American attacks. Bacon feels that Governor William Berkeley is too friendly to the natives, feels that the colonial government has too much power, the taxes are too much, the poor aren't getting enough money. Okay, so it's this struggle between the indentured servants and the lower class and the upper class, and that's some of the causes. And so what happens during the rebellion? Well, Bacon organizes attacks on Native American tribes, try to push them back and take their land. And actually, Bacon's forces end up taking control of Jamestown itself. Now, eventually, Bacon dies, actually from disease, but he dies, okay? And when he dies, the rebellion kind of fizzles out and the government regains control. But the effects are really the most important part here. And what the effects are is that it's going to highlight the tensions that we see between the upper and lower class in the colonies. And we still see tension today. We've probably seen this tension between upper and lower classes, for the entirety of American history. And after this, we're going to see stricter control of the lower classes, but probably the most important effect is that it's going to lead to an increased use of African slavery instead of indentured servants, because the idea is that they can have more control over African slaves and they're afraid of indentured servants starting rebellions like this. So make sure we kind of understand all this stuff about Bacon's Rebellion, the causes, what happened, and really those effects. Really important to get down. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about the Southern colonies and the West Indies. The Southern colonies are made up of North and South Carolina and Georgia. And the West Indies, you can see pictured here on this map, they're the islands in the Caribbean. And Great Britain is going to own the islands that are kind of in this yellow color on this map. Now, this map is from the 1700s, but it kind of gives you a good idea for what the colonies would have been. So in terms of the economy of these areas, they are really focused on plantation economy and cash crops. Now, a plantation is a large farm that is really focused on making money. So they're going to grow one lucrative crop like tobacco or sugar or rice, and later it's going to be cotton, and they're going to export these crops to try to make money off of them. Now, how are they going to grow all these crops? How are they going to make so much money? A lot of it has to do with the fact that most of the slaves in the colonies are going to go to these areas, the Southern colonies and the West Indies. And as they come here, they're going to go through a route called the Middle Passage from Africa to the New World. And it's important to know that term, Middle Passage. 20% of them actually die on the route towards the New World. So because they have so much slavery, that makes up a lot of their demographics. In some areas, it's about 50% of the population. And because there's so many slaves, they have harsh and strict slave codes. And slave codes are basically laws that are created about what slaves can and cannot do to try to ensure that they're not having slave rebellions. Now, at the same time, slaves are going to try to seek autonomy. They're going to try to preserve some sense of self. And they're going to do this through their culture. An example of this is trying to create unique languages. One specific example is Gullah in South Carolina and Georgia. And then they're also going to try to bring some of their religious beliefs, like animism, with them from where, their original religious beliefs that they had in Africa. All right, next and last of all, we're going to talk about the colonial government. And we want to understand, very important to know, is that the colonial governments are very democratic for their time. And while we might not think of them as democratic for today, like women couldn't vote or people of different races couldn't vote, but they're democratic for their time. And a lot of that has to do with because of the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment is going to influence those ideas, and that's an important concept to know. If we don't know what the Enlightenment is, we'll talk more about it in later lessons. But the Enlightenment is basically an intellectual movement, a philosophy movement in the 1700s. It's going to talk about reason and science and individualism and the power of knowledge. And those ideas are going to be brought over to the Americas and influence the type of government that is going to be created in the colonies. Let's talk about some examples. The Mayflower Compact in 1620. This is a foundational document created by the Pilgrims on the Mayflower ship as they come over in 1620. And it's basically the governing agreement for the settlers. It has their legal framework for self-governance in the Plymouth colony. It emphasizes things like majority rule, consent to the governed, the establishment of laws for the general good of the community. And it lays a lot of the democratic principles that the U.S. Constitution is going to be built off of later. So it's good to know of the Mayflower Compact. And then another second example, in New England, they have these things called town hall meetings and colonial legislatures where more people have a say in politics. Now, voting is limited to landowning white male church members, which may not seem very democratic, but again, for the time it is, and being able to vote in this kind of situation or this kind of government was more democratic than what they were used to in Britain. And lastly, in the southern colonies, again, it's dominated by elite planters, and some of the governors are going to be appointed by England, but they do have representative forms of government. For example, and this is a really important example to know, the Virginia House of Burgesses from 1619. Try to commit this one to memory. This is the first form of representative government in the colonies. And again, voting requirements, landowning, white men, but it's more democratic than what it had used to be or what they were used to in England. So that is it for our notes on the regions of British colonies. Make sure you're able to answer these big idea questions. Number one, compare and contrast. So what's similar and what's different? The economy of each colonial region. Number two, compare and contrast the demographics of each colonial region. And by demographics, think about the people who lived there, their religions, their makeup, slavery, immigration, that kind of stuff. And the third, and this is a really tough one, but it's a really important one to know. So take some time with this third one. But how did the exchange of goods, stuff, ideas like the Enlightenment, and people between Europe and the colonies create different and similar regions in the colonies? This is a very tough question to answer, but it's a really important one to be able to do. We want to think about how are these colonies being created? What's different about them? What's similar about them? And how they're being created in this way because of these exchange of goods, ideas, and people. So take some time to really think about this one and give some examples. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you next time.